Joining us now is Laura Dickinson. Professor Dickinson is an attorney, and she is a professor of law at George Washington University. She is joining us today to talk about an article she has written on drone contractors. Professor Dickinson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you've just written a piece for Just Security in the last couple of weeks called Drone Contractors, an Oversight and Accountability Gap. And I thought it was important to let people know what you had to say about this from a legal perspective. Would you mind just giving us a brief summary of the thoughts behind that article?
Sure. Well, it's by now no secret that the U.S. military uses a large number of contractors overseas, whether performing security or building bases and so forth. But what is less common, what is less known, is that contractors are very much involved in the drone program. It takes about 160 to 180 people to manage each 24 combat air patrol of a Predator or a Reaper. And that's a lot of people.
Right.
And some significant proportion of them are contractors. So what are they doing? What are all these people doing? Some of them are remotely piloting the vehicle. Some of them are maintaining the vehicle. Some of them are doing imagery analysis. Some of them are making a decision whether to strike a target, and some of them are engaging in targeting. And the problem is that we don't have a lot of transparency about the breakdown of contractors performing these functions. We have some estimates, but we really need much more transparency about the role that contractors are performing here.
Now, I want to get back to the transparency issue and the need for transparency, but Professor Dickinson, I guess a couple things come to mind when you say that. First of all, I don't think very many people know how many human beings are involved in the flight of a single drone. I think people picture it as a kind of as part of a first-person shooter kind of gaming universe, one drone, one operator. I think for a lot of people, this will be the first time they've heard that it takes a lot of people to keep a drone aloft or to execute a drone mission. I guess that's number one. But number two, I guess what occurs to me, and I wanted to, and maybe this will get us back to the issue of transparency. You have, when a drone is sent on a mission, first of all, you have a separation of accountability in a sort of moral sense, because you have a machine mediating between human beings and whatever the machine is addressing and or attacking. So you have that, and then you have on the other end of the machine's telecommunications link, you have, as you've described it in your piece, and it was very striking to me, an extraordinary diffusion of human responsibility among individuals and organizations as well, many of which are non-governmental in nature. First of all, I want to ask you, does that sound to you like a fair characterization of the situation?
Well, I think that you have so many different people, and some of them from the private sector, involved. It does raise questions about oversight and accountability. As we've seen before, when you outsource functions, whether it's security or other functions, you need to have supervision of the contractors to make sure they're doing the job correctly. And sometimes that supervision can be a problem, as we've seen in the earlier phases of our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, when we saw that there were more than 260,000 contractors, a ratio of contractors to troops that at times exceeded 1-to-1, and an estimated $30 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse, according to the Commission for Wartime Contracting. So when you have actors in the private sector, many of them who are trying to do a good job, still it takes a lot of supervision to make sure that they are complying with standards regarding the use of force and so forth, as we've seen in the context of security contractors. So again, in the arena of drone contractors, we don't have clear enough information about exactly what they're doing, but we know they're there, and so it raises the question of how much oversight are they getting, how much supervision, what is the relationship between the contractors and the governmental employees who are operating the drones.
Now, we're talking with Professor Laura Dickinson of George Washington University Law School about drone contractor accountability. And I guess one of the things that strikes me is accountability is cut several ways to me in this situation. One form of accountability is accountability for ensuring that you are acting lawfully. For example, we had the case of contractors in Iraq from Blackwater unlawfully killing civilians and so on, and the legal issues that surrounded that. Is that the kind of accountability you're talking about? Because there's also the accountability that has to do with making sure you're not bilking the government, making sure you are not a conduit for illegal orders that would be illegal if executed by members of the U.S. military. So, and we're talking, and ultimately, we're talking about the ultimate legality of targeted drone killings as well. So I'm just trying to get a sense of which are the dimensions of accountability we need to get our hands on here.
Well, I think you're quite right to suggest that accountability has a lot of different components, and I would actually divide it up further. I would divide it up between the aspect of accountability that means oversight before the fact, making sure that contractors or whomever are following the appropriate standards, whether it's with respect to imagery analysis of a feed coming in from a drone, or in the case of a security contractor, using force appropriately. So oversight in advance. And then another aspect of accountability is if something goes wrong, if somebody makes a mistake or intentionally commits some kind of a harm, what kind of redress is there? And I would divide it up that way as well. And so I think on the front end, when you have a lot of contractors and the ratio of contractors to uniformed personnel is high, it raises questions about supervision. And then with respect to accountability if something goes wrong, that's also a big issue. When you're dealing with contractors, of course, individuals can be fired, so that's one form of accountability. But what about if the behavior is criminal? We have enormous jurisdictional problems when the contractor is working overseas. It's very unclear if the contractor is not working for the Defense Department whether our courts even have the power to hear those cases, because the federal law that provides jurisdiction is ambiguous. And so, I mean, one of the things I argue is that we need to close the loophole in federal law and make it clear that all contractors, whether working for the Defense Department or other agencies, could be held criminally responsible if they do, in fact, commit a crime.
So a law professor, let me just jump in with a question there. We're talking to law professor Laura Dickinson. So is there in some way, if we're talking about, let's say, illegal acts committed using drone technology under international law or domestic, in this case, domestic U.S. law, is there some legal parallel with the process of renditions where the CIA would, through rendition, take prisoners to third-party countries for torturing purposes so that the prisoners might not be, the acts might not be prosecutable under U.S. law? Is there some sort of parallel there?
Right. Now, I don't want to say that contractors are committing crimes because we don't have evidence that they are. We just don't have enough information about what roles contractors are playing. But if a CIA contractor involved in the drone program were to commit a crime overseas, then it would be unclear whether U.S. courts would have jurisdiction to criminally prosecute that individual because the existing federal statute leaves that ambiguous.
So,
I want to go.
Yeah, just to clarify then, okay, so no, we're not saying we have any evidence of wrongdoing, but we are saying that there may be a serious jurisdictional problem and that we need a lot more information in order to make sure it's being done with the proper safeguards legally and so on. I guess that's what we're saying, right?
That's right. That's right. I want to be careful not to necessarily say that any contractors are committing crimes in this case. But what I do want to say, though, is that we do need more information. And there was actually a recent report published by the British Bureau of Investigative Journalism, of journalists, that actually relied on interviews and FOIA requests to try to give a little bit clearer picture of what the drone contractors are doing. And while in the U.S. military's program, not the CIA program, and the U.S. military has said that it's not having the contractors select targets, but they are analyzing the images that come in through the drone feed. And one of the issues is that a lot of the government personnel are leaning on, they say they're leaning on the contractors because in some cases the contractors have more experience. And that raises questions about whether the contractors could potentially effectively be making targeting decisions. And that raises questions about whether we really want contractors doing that. And so that's why I think we need more transparency about what kind of supervision the contractors are getting.
Right.
What the ratio is between contractors and governmental personnel, and how the military is ensuring that it's, you know, the uniformed personnel that are making those targeting decisions in practice.
And I suppose I would add to that, Professor Laura Dickinson, that there's always the possibility. Again, we don't know. You've made that point clear. But there's in my experience with government contracting has been that there is a financial incentive sometimes to reach certain targets, certain goals. In this case, maybe mission rates or kill rates or whatever. So it's very worth knowing the answers to these unanswered questions. At least that's how it seems to me. But I guess the next question I would ask you then is, okay, if you could, what are the changes you would put in place now to get this accountability problem with drone contractors under better control?
Thank you for asking that. I mean, the first thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that we need more transparency. I would argue that we need a permanent inspector general for oversight of contractors performing security functions that have an impact overseas. During the height of the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan and its previous phases, we had a special inspector general for Iraq reconstruction. That was really important because that inspector general did on-the-ground interviews, provided data, and reporting on what the contractors were doing. That was very important for the debate in Congress, and it was very important for the public debate about the role of contractors. And the Afghanistan Inspector General has performed a similar function. But now that the Iraq Inspector General's mandate has lapsed, we have a gaping transparency hole. And we shouldn't have to rely on a trickle of, journalistic accounts like the recent Bureau of Investigative Journalists report to get a little bit of information here and a little bit of information here. We need more regular data and accounting of what these contractors are doing. For example, the Defense Department has gotten much better about reporting on what contractors are doing, but they still don't break down the role of drone contractors. They do, for example, give a quarterly report on, how many security contractors are in Afghanistan and so forth. But we need to have information about the drone contractors. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's very important is for us to close that loophole in the law that gives our courts jurisdiction to consider those egregious cases when contractors do break the law overseas and close the gap so that contractors who work for agencies other than the Defense Department can be prosecuted if the need should arise in the United States courts.
Okay, that's a great summary, and let's leave it there. We've been talking with Professor Laura Dickinson of George Washington University about her article in justsecurity.org, Drone Contractors and Oversight and Accountability Gap. Professor Dickinson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.